Tonight we welcome Marlee Miller, instructor of geology at the University of Oregon and author of the books Roadside Geology of Oregon and Roadside Geology of Washington. Oregon and Washington feature a variety of physiographic regions with stories tied to explosive volcanic activity, effects of glaciation, continental growth, and massive floods of lava and water. The talk will provide a geologic explanation and photographic road trip for many subtle and eye-catching roadside landscapes and rock formations. Marlee Miller and co-author Daryl Cohen published a complete rewrite, of the book Roadside Geology of Washington in late 2017, and before that she rewrote Roadside Geology of Oregon. Ms. Miller joined the U of O in 1997, where she currently is a senior instructor and researcher with the Department of Earth Sciences. She earned her master's and PhD in geology at the University of Washington and her bachelor's in geology at Colorado College. As a photographer with 35 years of geological field research, her photos capture many geologic and geomorphic environments. Ms. Miller's website, geologypics.com, offers free downloads of more than 2,000 images for non-commercial use. You may see her photos in textbooks, museum exhibits, journals, and teaching collections of other instructors. And with that, we welcome Marlee. Thank you. There you go. Give you that.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I sent a text to my daughter about a half an hour, and I said, I'm giving a talk at the Axe and Fiddle. And she wrote me back and said, that sounds like a cool place. She's in Denver, so. Anyway, I'm really thrilled to be here and talking about geology of Oregon and Washington. And this talk pretty much came out of writing these two roadside geology books. It was, looking back on it especially, it was such a privilege to be able to do this and to be able to drive all over these two beautiful states and really get to know them in a way I never had before, and at the same time feel like I was doing something legitimate as opposed to just driving around. And I had so much help from so many people. It was great. I had some friends who traveled more than 1,000 miles with me on roads. I actually had one friend, my friend Birgitta, who traveled more than 5,000 miles with me in Oregon, and we're still friends. We had very different styles. As you can probably tell, I tend to be a little amped up. She's like really calm all the time and would always want to like stop and look at flowers and things like that, which, I mean, you know, we were out looking at rocks. And so we had some differences there. Well, I got one story I got to tell you before we get to the slides. So she was very methodical in her ways. And we were driving through Burns. And, of course, Marlee had this agenda. And she was driving, and we had to stop at a gas station to get gas. And that was okay because you need gas. But she pulled in. She was driving a little too slowly, but that was okay. We needed gas. So the guy came out, and he starts pumping the gas. And she's sitting there, and she says, I think I'll wash the windshield. I said, cool, go wash the windshield, you know. It's still pumping gas. Like, we can't leave. You might as well pump the windshield or wash the windshield. So she starts washing the windshield. And, you know, the gas is still pumping. So it's okay. But then the gas clicked off. And she was still washing the windshield. And finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I said, that's beautiful. And she looked at me and she goes, I think I'll wash the back windshield. Anyway, like I said, we're still friends. I'm actually on my way to Death Valley right now. My car's all packed and I'm heading down there and I'm going to see her. That's where she is right now. And I did, you know, like I said, so many people helped so much. And if you do get a chance to look at one of the books, I hope you get a look at the acknowledgments, because there's a lot of great people in there. Okay, well, let's get on to the slides. I'm sure you're all very familiar with how many beautiful places we have in Oregon and Washington. This is the Bandon Beach. You can see these sea stacks. They form because they basically have eroded from the nearby cliffs. And there's beautiful beaches in Washington State as well. These are the Cascades, an aerial view over Mackenzie Pass, looking south towards the Three Sisters on the right. And there's Bachelor Butte and Broken Top. And so we've got this chain of volcanoes in Oregon. They go up into Washington State. There's Mount Rainier. There's, of course, Mount St. Helens, Mount Baker, and Glacier Peak. So there's a number of Cascade volcanoes in Washington as well. If you go to northern Washington, you get into the North Cascades Range, which are not volcanic. They're metamorphic rock that has formed deep in the crust and has been uplifted, and as you can see, it's now being eroded by these glaciers. There's home to the greatest concentration of glaciers in the conterminous U.S. If you go east of the sort of north-south Cascades axis, if you will, you get in a much drier landscape. Here's looking into the Yakima Valley in Washington State. And down in Oregon, you can get into the Basin and Range province, and you get these big temporary lakes. This is Lake Abert, and you can see as it's evaporating, it's leaving behind a crust of salt. So if you look at this map of the physiography of Oregon and Washington, you can see just how variable it is. And in fact, the U.S. Geological Survey has taken this and divided it up into a number of different provinces. So, for example, here's the Cascades. They go up into Washington. There's a few Cascade volcanoes that poke through the North Cascades area, the Coast Range, and so on and so forth. There's all these different provinces. And that's the physiography. But the physiography really, in large part, depends on the geology. So here's a cross-section of the geology across Oregon. And it's pretty complicated, but there's the one thing I really want you to see is this red dashed line here, because it separates these lower rocks, which we call the basement, from the upper rocks, which we call the cover. And that's really going to be the format of the talk. I'm first going to talk about the basement and sort of how that came to be, and skip around Oregon and Washington looking at where we can see basement and what that tells us. And then I'll talk about the cover, and to do that, we'll focus in on the Columbia Gorge and some of the things you can see in the Columbia Gorge. So before we get into really talking about the basement, though, and I'll start with this one here, Silesia, which is underneath the Coast Range. But before we get to that, I want to just give a brief overview of plate tectonics, because plate tectonics is really what has controlled so much of Oregon and Washington's geology. And the theory basically holds that the Earth's outer shell, called the lithosphere, is broken into these gigantic fragments called plates. And so each one of those plates is shown by the different color. And as these plates move around, they cause earthquakes, they cause mountain belts to form, they cause volcanoes to form. And in the Pacific Northwest, where we are, you can see we've got three plates. We've got the Pacific plate in kind of yellow, we've got the Juan de Fuca plate, this small blue thing, and then in brown there's the North American plate. Now the next slide is a close-up of that area. So here's the Pacific plate now in gray, Juan de Fuca plate in light blue, and then beginning at this red line right here, we've got the North American plate. And what's happening is that the Juan de Fuca plate is pulling away from the Pacific plate, and it's diving underneath the North American plate at this feature called the Cascadia subduction zone. And so in a cross-sectional view, let me also point out the Cascade volcanoes. Those are these stars right here. So in a cross-sectional view, it looks something like this, where the Juan de Fuca plate is going underneath North America. And what happens is as it subducts underneath North America, it heats up, and that causes it to dehydrate. So the water rises out of this subducting plate into the overlying hot lithosphere of the North American plate, and that causes melting in the North American plate. And then these blobs of magma gradually rise, and they can fuel the volcanoes, which is why the Cascade volcanoes run parallel to that subduction zone. Now, as it turns out, in Oregon and Washington, this subduction has been really important as you go into the past. We see the Cascade volcanoes today. Here again, these are the sisters. You can see that's Mount Jefferson up there. I think if you really get eyes, you can kind of make out Mount Hood, or maybe if you had too much to drink, you can see Mount Hood. But basically, they make this line, and but they've been very important in the past. So if you think about these volcanoes, they're erupting on occasion because they're being fueled by magma, which is continually rising from the above the subducted plate. And not all that magma makes it to the surface. A lot of it is going to stay underneath the surface, and it's going to cool, and it's going to crystallize as an intrusive igneous rock. Probably the best well-known of those is granite. So we see a lot of granite in throughout much of the Cascades, actually. We see it in the Klamath Mountains and in the Wallowas. We see it in the North Cascades, and we also see it in the Okanagan Highlands a lot. And this granite can get as old as like 140, 150 million years old. So this process has been going on for a long time. This process is also important because it explains how the continent has grown through time. And it's this process called continental accretion. So you can imagine, here's our oceanic lithosphere subducting underneath North America. And if there's a topographically high area on the subducting plate, such as an oceanic plateau or an island arc complex or seamounts or something like that, when they get into the subduction zone, they'll jam up the subduction zone, and they might cause subduction to stop. But these two plates are still converging with each other, so eventually a new subduction zone will break farther offshore, and this stuff will get added onto the continent. And so if you look back at that cross-section, you can see here's the edge of North America at the end of the Paleozoic era, and these pieces of basement rock, the different colors, have all been added one after the other through this process of continental accretion. The most recent being Siletzia here, which is what underlies the Coast Range. If you look at a similar cross-section across Washington, you can see that it's actually very similar. You still have Siletzia underneath the Coast Range. You've got some different accreted terrains there. Again, there's the edge of North America. Some similarities in the cover and some differences there as well. So if you look at Siletzia, one of the main things you'll see is that Siletzia is almost entirely basalt. But a lot of the basalt is made out of these sort of blob shapes that we call pillows, pillow basalt. And it forms typically because it's erupted under the sea. So it also forms when lava sometimes flows into water. But so if you can imagine a seafloor vent expelling blobs of magma, that magma gets up into the cold water and it chills around its outer surface, but the inside stays kind of warm or hot and malleable, and then it settles down to the seafloor, and then another blob erupts and it settles on top. So after a while, you get a whole accumulation of these blobs that we call pillows. And you see that throughout much of Siletzia. So if you look at a geologic map, and this shows the west coast here up to Washington, there's the Olympic Peninsula, you can see that in purple is wherever we see Siletzia showing up from underneath the younger rocks. So we see it down from Roseburg all the way up to the Olympic Mountains up here in northern Washington state. In fact, we also see it up on southern Vancouver Island. So it's a really, really big province. These rocks formed and then were accreted about 51 to 49 million years ago. And then after that, new sediment was deposited over the top, which turned into sedimentary rock. And so what we see, if you look at the geologic map, you've got all these other colors, which are the younger material that was deposited over the top. So if you were to drill a well, say right through this greenish stuff here, you would go through those younger rocks and eventually go down into the basement rock of Siletzia. Now we can go up to the Olympic Peninsula, and if you go along the Hurricane Ridge Road, so out of Port Angeles, there's this road that goes right like this, and you can see it crosses the purple band here, which is it's called the Crescent Formation, but it's still Siletzia. You can go right along this road, right through these amazing cliffs of the pillow basalts. I mean, there's pull-outs. You can get out. You can pet the rocks. It's just amazing. And then as you continue driving through, you get into what's called the Olympic Core. And so you can look out towards Mount Olympus. And so this is at the top of the Hurricane Ridge Road. Mount Olympus is back here. Here's Mount Olympus. So you're looking from here to there. And you're looking into the core, which is a different rock unit called the Olympic Subduction Complex. And this is material that is actually being scraped off the plate today and being added on to the edge of the continent. I mean, this stuff was up here, and Mount Olympus itself was actually scraped off some 20, 30 million years ago, but the process has been going on, and it's still going on offshore. So you can look at the rocks up at the Hurricane Ridge Road, and you can see they're metamorphosed, and then you can go down to the coast here, and you can see more rocks, the Olympic Subduction Complex, and you can see they're entirely different. And that's one of the things about it is because this stuff is getting scraped off the plate, it's really variable and it's really kind of very confusing. It's highly deformed. So here at Second Beach is you can hike to this place, and it's you can see beautiful coastal landforms like that sea arch. And if you look at the rocks, you can see that they're all broken up little pieces of rock that together make the rock. And this material is almost all sandstone, except for this white chunk here, which is a piece of limestone. And so these things have been interpreted as submarine debris flows, where everything's getting all mixed up as it's flowing down a slope underneath the ocean. You can go to other beaches and you can see different things, altogether different rocks. This is at Beach 4 where you can see that you've got sandstone and shale, and they're tilted up on ends, so you know that sedimentary rocks start off horizontally, and these have been tilted up. And in fact, if you look closely at these rocks, you can see evidence that they weren't just tilted to where they are now. They were tilted to vertical and kept going, and they're overturned. So in fact, you're going in this direction, you're actually going into younger rocks. And if you go just around the corner, you can see this. Now, we have this saying that a lot of times you hear people say that, the rocks suffer deformation. Well, actually, rocks enjoy deformation. And you can tell that, like there's a nice little smiley face here. So anyway, the point being, though, is this subduction complex, it's highly deformed and really, really variable. Now, here's a geologic a map of the West Coast, and all the colors here are accreted terrains. And you can see here's Oregon and Washington. The Olympic subduction complex is in yellow, and here's Silesia in purple. The edge of Paleozoic North America is where you go from gray into the colors. And you can see that Oregon the basement rock is all accreted. And in Washington, there's just a little bit here of Paleozoic North America. But that raises a question. How do you know when you're on an accreted terrain or not? And well, a lot of times you don't. A lot of times you can't tell because you're up in the cover, and what you really need to see is the basement. But in a lot of places where you can see the basement, you can see some features that will tell you just that you're actually on Paleozoic North America. And a really good example of that actually is in the Grand Canyon. And here you can see the basement rock, which is over 1 billion years old. And above that, you see sandstone, shale, and limestone, which are these sedimentary rocks that were deposited as the ocean moved up onto the continent over 500 million years ago during the Cambrian period. You do see this throughout much of the American West. You can see it in the Teton Range. You can see it right behind the mountains just north of Salt Lake City. You can see it in Montana. Actually, I taught for 3 years in Wisconsin. We could actually see it in Wisconsin. But you don't see it on the accreted terrains. And that's because they weren't there. They were accreted after these rocks were deposited. But if you go up to Washington State in the northeastern corner here, you can see the evidence for these rocks. And instead of just showing you a cliff face, I thought I'd show you one of my favorite waterfalls. This is Sweet Creek Falls in northern Washington. And what you're looking at here, and it's always seemed to be so hot when I was up there. It was such a great respite. But these cobbles are quartzite, and quartzite is metamorphosed sandstone. So these came from Cambrian sandstones that were metamorphosed that are up the river, and above those cliffs of the Cambrian quartzite, you can find metamorphosed shale and metamorphosed limestone, and then here's some more metamorphosed shale that just sits just above those. It's a slightly younger rock called the Ledbetter Slate. But whatever, these rocks are definitely part of what was Paleozoic North America. Now, if you get back on the road and you get on the Highway 20, you can follow that and leave North America and go into this area Q for Quinella and keep driving, and these are accreted terrains, and then cross the North Cascades, which are a whole series of accreted terrains. Then when you get into the Puget lowland area, you can take a ferry across and get back on the Silesia. So Highway 20 in northern Washington State basically does this traverse through all these accreted terrains. If you go to Oregon, so here's up here, those accreted terrains in northern Washington. We've talked about the Coast Range. I'm going to skip the Klamaths, but they're very similar in some ways to the Blue Mountains, where there's a lot of accreted terrains. And if you go to Joseph, which is in the very northeastern part of Oregon, you can see the Wallowa Mountains, which are part of the Wallowa accreted terrain. And I love this place. I mean, you can see the mountains just kind of come crashing right out of the ground. And they do so along a fault zone that's right along the base here. And the next photo is right of this area right here. And here's kind of a close-up view. And you can see there's a number of different rocks. There's this kind of uniform gray stuff. There's this red cap up here. But what I want you to see right now is this very layered rock here. And this rock is called the Martin Bridge limestone, and it's one of the key parts of the Wallowa accreted terrain. And it's a limestone, and the Wallowa terrain is interpreted to be an island arc complex. So if you think about the Cascades, they're a continental arc where the oceanic lithosphere subducts underneath continental lithosphere. An island arc forms out in the ocean where oceanic lithosphere will subduct underneath oceanic lithosphere. Something like Japan or parts of the Aleutian arc or lots of the islands in Indonesia are part of an island arc complex. And so in an island arc complex, you'd expect to see a lot of basalt flows and andesite flows, and we see metamorphosed andesite and basalt in the Wallowa terrain. You might see a coral reef surrounding the island arc, and that would be the Martin Bridge limestone. And also farther offshore, you get these sedimentary rocks called turbidites, which are much more deep marine kind of rocks. But what's really amazing about these limestones, as well as other limestones in the Blue Mountains, is that they contain fossils for which we have no counterparts in this part of the world. They all seem to have come from the ancient Tethys Ocean, which is in the far western Pacific. I mean, go figure. How does that happen? But these fossils there's just nothing like them here except on those terrains. And so, but we see plenty of them around. The Tethys Ocean was the ocean basically that separated Laurasia from Gondwana when it was breaking up some 200 to 100 million years ago. As the plates have rearranged themselves, the only thing that's left of it really is the Mediterranean. And so here now is the west coast of North America, and we've got these fossils. And the best explanation we have is that they've basically came through plate motions and over long periods of time, and then accretion onto the edge of the continent. So if you just go back to this diagram, you can imagine this maybe being an island arc complex, but it's like way over here, and then through time it gradually made it to North America and was accreted, and then successive terrains came and accreted after that. If we go back to this picture, then we've got the Martin Bridge limestone. We can see this rock is granite of the Wallowa batholith, and up here we've got lava flows of the Columbia River basalt group. So it would correspond to this little square on this cross-section, where here's the accreted terrain in blue, this is the intrusive body, and then we've got Columbia River basalt right here in brown. So we've got these three rocks. We can tell that the Martin Bridge limestone has to be the oldest because this stuff came in and invaded it, and then the Columbia River basalt group has to be the youngest because it's sitting right on top. So we've got limestone, followed by granite, followed by basalt, and then we can start kind of interpreting it. So the limestone was accreted as part of the Wallowa terrain. It was then intruded by the granite, which was different phases of the granite were between about 140 and 120 million years ago. And then there had to have been a period of uplift and erosion because granite forms deep within the crust, and we've got Columbia River basalt sitting on top of it. So there had to have been a period of uplift and erosion to get that granite up to the surface. And then the Columbia River basalt erupted, but then there had to have been more uplift and erosion because here we've got the Columbia River basalt sitting 4,000 feet above the valley floor because of that fault zone. And so it's also just this isolated cap. So there's been significant erosion that has removed much of the basalt from that particular area. And then the Columbia River basalt, it provides a nice segue into the cover because it's definitely part of the cover sequence. So we can all take a quick breather. And I'll start talking about the cover. And to do that, I want to talk about the Columbia River Gorge because, well, it's a beautiful place, but it's shared by both Oregon and Washington. So you can make a really cool field trip by driving up I-84 and going down Washington 14 or vice versa, and you can see everything from both sides of the river. Well, it's all cover rock, and you can see from just looking at these maps that it's has its own complexity. These are maps actually, the southern one is from my Oregon book, and the northern one is from the Washington book, and they're just two separate maps. This isn't the river. This is empty space here. The river is this blue thing, which is just repeated because the maps are, there's two maps. But there's also little points along the way that kind of point out cool things, and you can see there's a lot of those, so there's a lot to see as you drive up or down the Columbia Gorge. And what I did was for this talk, I kind of simplified the map, and you've got all these different rock types. There's landslides and river and flood sediments in yellow. There's Cascade Range basalt and andesite flows in pinks, and that includes Mount Hood right here. There's what are called the boring volcanics in this sort of magenta color. There's granitic rock. There's Columbia River basalt in these browns, and there's older volcanic and sedimentary rocks. And there's also this Troutdale Formation. Well, that's still kind of like, well, okay, rocks. I mean, I like rocks, but I'm trying to make this interesting, right? If you just talk about rocks. So I've got a few main points here that I want to make, that these rocks tell us that there's been a pretty long period of volcanic activity that we can see in the Columbia Gorge. It actually goes back about 35 million years. And the Columbia River itself is more than 15 million years old. We also see that the general shape of the gorge is really controlled by the bedrock, and it also contains some nice examples of some of what happened with the Ice Age floods. It's a nice way to kind of at least give some description of that, and I'm really jealous of the person who gets the book about the channeled scablands, by the way. So we can start on our field trip by just driving up either I-84 at the top or Washington 14 on the bottom. You can see there's quite a difference in one's road experience. And probably the first thing you notice is Mount Hood, which is the snow-capped mountain on the right. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this mountain here. This is Larch Mountain, which is a big shield volcano. It's part of the Boring Volcanics. And now the Boring Volcanics, they're not boring. They're named after the town of Boring, which is in the Portland area. Here's, let's see, where's Boring? There's Boring. And they've got a really cute bakery. But all the colors on this map are different ages of the Boring Volcanics. And so you can see that they're pretty much all over the Portland area. They cause a lot of the buttes and hills that you see in Portland are part of the Boring Volcanics. And they erupted from about 2.5 million years ago to just 57,000 years ago at Beacon Rock. And they're especially interesting partly because they're so young. There's a lot of them there, and over 2.5 million years, that's quite a lot of eruptive activity, which actually makes them a hazard. And so people are pretty focused on the Boring Volcanics and trying to understand them. And they're also kind of weird because they're west of the Cascades. You would expect most volcanic activity to be in the Cascades if it's related to the subduction. You can imagine, you can see here that the plate has to get to a certain depth before it's heated up enough that it drives off all that water to cause the magma to rise. But here we've got the Boring Volcanics to the west of the Cascades. And so we're still trying to understand just what that connection is. If you go up the river, you get to Beacon Rock, which is right there. And here's Beacon Rock. You can hike up Beacon Rock. It's anybody here hiked up Beacon Rock? There's like 1 million stairs. There's like a catwalk and stairways all the way up. It's pretty cool. It gives you nice views of the river. And behind it, you can see these hills, which have a lot of older volcanic rock in it, including the Columbia River Basalt Group. And here's another view, just a little bit upriver. Everything in this photo belongs to the Columbia River Basalt Group. They're all these basaltic lava flows. And you can see these ledges they just go for miles. You can see them across here, and those are individual lava flows. And these things flooded, they're called flood basalts. They completely flooded the landscape of northern Oregon and southern Washington. Most of them, not all, but most of them had their source right here in the eastern part of Washington and Oregon, and some of them actually flowed all the way down to the ocean and made their way down the coast somewhat. And they're like volumetrically really amazing. The area, the surface area they cover is more than 77,000 square miles. They have a volume that's more than 52,000 cubic miles, and that's pretty much impossible to get your heads around. But I learned that the National Park Service in the Grand Canyon has estimated the volume of air between the two rims of the Grand Canyon to be about 1,000 cubic miles, which means that the Columbia River Basalt Group is more than 50 times the volume of air between the rims in the Grand Canyon. That's a lot. That's amazing. And what's also amazing is they erupted from 17 to 6 million years ago, but 94% of that was erupted by 14 and a half. So over 2.5 million years, you get all this lava that was erupted. And it pretty much followed the path of the ancestral Columbia River. And that in itself is kind of a clue as to the age of the Columbia, that it was probably around then. But we can see some more direct evidence if we look at the rocks. If you go to Multnomah Falls, you can see that it's, this amazing waterfall. And these part of the Columbia River basalt called the Grand Ronde basalt. But if we zoom in up to the top, this lava flow up here, these rounded things are pillows. And so these things flowed into lakes. So it suggests that this was a lowland with lakes in it, possibly connected by a river. If you go farther up the gorge, you can see more of these pillow basalts. This is one that I didn't really stop at, but I'm kind of proud of that picture. If you go a little farther up to the Dalles, this is 3 minutes off the highway. So if you're driving up there, you gotta stop. At the intersection of US 197 and US 30, there's a great pullout, and you can go over there and you can see these pillows, and above it you can see columns. Okay, now the columns form when the basalt is on the land, and the pillows form when it's flowing into a lake. So this tells a story. You've got the lava flow coming in and flowing into the lake and making pillows. and then it fills up the lake, and then as it fills up the lake, then you get this transition here, and then it completely fills the lake, and then it flows over the top, and then the rest of it is on land. So you have this whole you can see these lakes kind of disappear before your very eyes. But the thing that really clinches it, that the Columbia River was around then, is this stuff called the Troutdale Formation, which are river gravels from the Columbia River. And we can see the Troutdale Formation in a number of places, but the thing that's really key is where you see it between some of the lava flows. And you can see that at Mitchell Point, where down here at the bottom, you've got Grand Ronde basalt, which is 16 to 15.6 million years old. Up here, you've got Wanapum basalt, which is part of the Columbia River basalt, and that's 15.6 to 15 million years old. So the outcrops of the Troutdale in here must be older than 15 million years old. So the river was there. Now, another thing about the river is, the gorge, is that it's asymmetric. You have these really steep cliffs on the north side of Oregon, and it's much more gentle terrain, although there's a number of cliffs too, but pretty gentle terrain overall on the Washington side, which also really influences your drive, because if you're on I-84, it's really fast and furious, and you got the cliffs soaring overhead, whereas on the Washington side, you're kind of looking across the cliffs. There's a lot of pullouts. The road's pretty fast, but there's not nearly the traffic, so it's kind of a nice alternate way to go. But this asymmetry and it ties right into the bedrock because the bedrock is tilted gently towards the south. That means on the north side of the river, it's tilted towards the river and it can facilitate sliding, whereas on the south side, it's tilted away from the river. And you can get landslides, but they're not nearly as big. And another thing about it is that because of the nature of the rocks, the Columbia River basalt is highly fractured, and so water can seep through it quite easily. Then it soaks through this other rock unit called the Eagle Creek Formation, but then it gets down to the Ohanapakash Formation, which has this very impermeable top to it because it's been highly altered. And the water kind of pools right here at the top. And what that does is it raises the fluid pressure in there, and it kind of lifts up the overlying rock, which then that facilitates sliding. So you get these big landslides on the north side. And so this is all what's called the Skamania slide right here. And in fact, this rock, which you can kind of make out, is part of that slide. We have these slides going all the way up and down the river. Here's a view from Beacon Rock looking across. This is Eagle Creek Formation, which is tilted gently to the south. Here's a view of what the Eagle Creek Formation looks like. These are lahars from an early Cascade volcano, probably about 20 million years old, so it goes back that far. If you go underneath it, there's Ohanapakash, which is actually beautifully exposed up around Mount Rainier, but that stuff gets to be as old as 35 million years old. Here's a view of the Bonneville landslide right here. You can see that it pushed the river to the south. This is Bonneville Dam right here. Here's Bridge of the Gods. And this slide slid about 600 years ago, and it blocked the river temporarily, which caused a lake to form behind it that backed up all the way to Wallula Gap. And eventually that lake broke through the landslide and caused a huge flood down the river. It would have inundated today's Portland to a depth of about 20 feet. So these landslides can also cause floods. Well, that's nothing actually compared to the Ice Age floods, also called the Missoula floods. This is Crown Point, Vista House. Oh, you can see Beacon Rock back there. The largest Missoula floods that came down the river were the crest was nearly 100 feet above Vista House. So imagine, just imagine all that water coming down here. And the basic story behind the Missoula floods, also called the Ice Age floods because they didn't all originate from Lake Missoula, but here's Missoula, and this is in blue. You can see the ice from the Cordilleran ice sheet, and a number of tongues of the ice made it farther south, like down here, down the Puget Lowland. Seattle was actually under 3,000 feet of ice at the maximum. And here's this tongue of ice that came down, and it blocked the Clark Fork. And that's a river that drains northwestern Montana. It blocked the river, so it causes big lake to form behind it, which backed up all the way past Missoula and down the valley there. And you can see just how, I mean, look at the scale. That's 100 miles, so more than 100 miles down to Missoula. And to get an idea how deep this lake was, you can go to Missoula, and you can see these horizontal lines. Those are old shorelines from this lake, and they're more than 1,000 feet above the valley floor. So this is a huge, huge lake, and it eventually broke through the ice and then coursed its way down through and created the channeled scablands and got into the Columbia River drainage and made it out to the sea. And on the way, there were a number of constrictions in the channel. There's Wallula Gap here, which then caused the lake to back up back here. Kalama Gap caused a lake to back up behind it all the way down almost to Eugene, but not quite. This shows it all the way to Eugene, but it doesn't quite go all the way there. And it also then created a lot of features. Like you can see scablands, where if you imagine the water coming through here and tearing up all the topsoil, pulling up a lot of the bedrock, certainly not all the bedrock because that goes all the way down to the mantle, but pulling up a lot of bedrock, and then so you get these remnants here that we call scablands. As you drive up the gorge, you can start developing an eye for this, and you start seeing scablands kind of all over the place because these floods were so profound. There's also a lot of gravel deposits, and many of these deposits are full of boulders and deposited by the floods. In fact, Portland actually mines a lot of these because a lot of these were deposited kind of on the lee side of some of the hills, and so they found it to be a very good source of aggregate. Okay, so we can take all these different rock units, we can make a little cross-section that just kind of provide an overall view of what you see in the Columbia Gorge. In blue here, we've got the earliest Cascade volcanic and sedimentary rocks, which point to an early age of volcanic activity. In brown here, we've got the Columbia River basalt group, the boring volcanics in this magenta color, younger Cascade Range basalt and andesite. There's Mount Hood, Ice Age flood features and landslides down closer to the river, and the Troutdale Formation in various places. So they basically do tell this story of this long-lived volcanic activity. The Columbia River's older than 15 million years old. Bedrock controls the shape of the gorge, and we can see evidence for the Ice Age floods. But you can get some more perspective on this cross-section if you compare it to the other one, which depicted the more regional view. Right off the bat, you can see this is, in fact, all within the cover. The Columbia Gorge should be somewhat right about there. And so the accreted terrains are below that. And it also tells you that while this is an interesting story here in the Columbia Gorge, it's really only part of the cover story. And to really get a grasp on that, you need to go out and drive to a lot of other places and see more of it. There's all these other things. But I really like this lower cross-section, actually, because, well, for one thing, it allows me to pretty much assess right away the geologic history. It starts with the addition of the accreted terrains, or the accretion of the accreted terrains onto the edge of North America, one after the other, finishing with Silesia, and then deposition or eruption of younger rocks in the cover, kind of one after the other after that. But it also serves as a real kind of springboard to my imagination, because, I mean, imagine the Columbia River basalt group flooding the landscape some 15 million years ago. Thousands and thousands of cubic miles of this lava. Or try to wrap your heads around the accretion, the fossils in some of the limestones of the Blue Mountains terrains, originating from the Western Pacific. And the details, you know, I guess what I find so exciting is that the more you learn about one of those rock units, the more complicated and three-dimensional and the whole rock becomes. It gives you so much more information. So as a quick example, you know, here are the Cascades. And we know just how complex and amazing the Cascades are. We can take one piece of it, Crater Lake. It formed about 7,700 years ago when Mount Mazama, a stratovolcano, erupted so catastrophically it collapsed down on itself and created this big hole. There was later eruptions. We can see that here at Wizard Island. It eventually filled in with water. It's this incredibly deep, beautiful lake. It's Oregon's national park. You can go there and hike around and really get to know it at your own intimate way and see all the interesting places. And if you study the geology there, you'll learn that Mount Mazama has its own history that goes back over 400,000 years. And yet, it's still just a tiny part of the Cascades, which are a tiny part of this diagram. So it really does kind of, the more you learn about one thing, the more it kind of expands outwards. And I think that's what I love so much about geology, because there's always going to be more to learn. Thank you. Question. Wow. Oh, Brent Dalrymple, you said? Oh, okay. I know his name for geologic, geochronology, dating stuff and things like that. Yeah. So you're saying that in 1955 you learned that volcanoes or mountains basically were the result of the core cooling down and causing everything to contract. Wow. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, with plate tectonics, soon after that, we really kind of revolutionized the way we look at a lot of things. Yeah. Yeah, the question is why are the Olympics so tall, especially when compared to, say, the Coast Range farther south? But there's a lot more uplift there, and it's probably related to the overall geometry of the plate margin, because if you look at a map, you can see that the subduction zone, in fact, I'm not sure I think, I don't know how to do this without scanning through the whole thing. But basically the subduction zone kind of goes north, and then it goes like that as it goes into another fault zone. And so things take a big bend there, and I think that causes them to kind of crinkle up. And so you get a lot of more active uplift in the Olympics, and you get the accretionary wedge, or the Olympic subduction complex, is actually exposed on land. We have that down here too, but it's offshore and not exposed. Yeah. Any others? Oh my God. Oh, there's a question. Oh, where was that photo? Oh, oh, okay. So at Bandon, the sea stacks, they're part of a they're part of a rock unit called the Otter Point Formation, which is sort of an accreted terrain within what's called the Franciscan assemblage. So all that stuff was accreted, but basically added to it's a big subduction complex, sort of like the Olympic subduction complex. It's only, except it's like 200 million years old. It's much, much older. That rock is those sea stacks are actually, I'm pretty sure there is some basalt in the Otter Point, but those sea stacks are actually mostly sandstone. But if you walk around Bandon Beach, you'll see there's a lot more than sandstone. There's like really red chert, which is a deep marine sedimentary rock. There's greenstone, which is a metamorphosed basalt. And there's these shales, and it's all kind of mixed together. And so it was kind of thrown together as in a subduction. Bandon's an amazing beach. I mean, there's so many different rocks. There's blue schist too, which is a metamorphic rock that really only forms in subduction zones. Oh. Oh. What was my favorite part of New Zealand? Well, yeah, I was in New Zealand. I'm on sabbatical this year at University of Oregon, and so I've been able to do a lot of traveling. And I I was in New Zealand for much of January, and there was a big earthquake there near the town of Kaikoura just a year and a half ago. It's on the South Island, and I got to spend a night in Kaikoura, and I think my favorite part actually was walking around the headland there, and there's coastal uplift from this earthquake a year and a half ago. Then you have these beaches that are stranded up above the water, and this big platform. Like if you go to Sunset Bay, you know, the intertidal zone where you can go looking for life and things like that in the rocks, and it's this flat bench that's exposed when the tide's low. Well, it's the same thing there. It's this big flat bench, but it's mostly above high tide level now. And so it's just an amazing place. Yeah. I think that was my favorite. But there's a lot of favorites. It was a great place. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, the Juan-Fuca plate is basically moving to the north and northeast. It's a little deceptive looking at that map because it looks like everything's heading to the southeast, but it's not actually moving straight out from the spreading center towards the subduction zone. Everything's kind of moving up towards the northeast. Yeah. Did it say that again? Sorry. Oh, yes. So the question is it would the big earthquake that people talk about, would that be on the subduction zone? And yes, that's what we fear the most as far as a major earthquake event, that it could possibly rupture along much of the coast, and it has in the past. You can see evidence for that. There are these things called ghost trees, or ghost forests, and you can see these trees that were in the interseismic period between earthquakes. Everything's kind of, is under stress, and it's gradually bowing up, which causes the land right near the coastline to rise a little bit, and you can establish forests just above high tide. But then during an earthquake, that stuff then subsides and it drowns all the trees. And so you can find ghost forests up and down the coastline and things like that. So it's hard to say when that'll happen, but someday, hopefully after we're all gone, that's when it'll happen. Yes. They had to tear it down because the earthquake, yeah. Yeah, that's pretty scary. We are pretty far from the coastline, which is somewhat comforting. Yes. Oh, I should have looked that up before I came here. I don't know. It's Claudia, might you know? It's a few centimeters. Yeah, a few centimeters a year. I can't give you an exact number, but it's on the order of centimeters a year. You know, I don't know. I know that one of the reasons we might be prone to larger, less frequent earthquakes is that the spreading center where the new oceanic lithosphere is created is pretty close to the subduction zone, so that the lithosphere that's subducting is pretty warm and more buoyant than a lot of older plates that might get subducted elsewhere. And so that causes it to stick more. And so that it causes the strain energy basically to build up. But I don't know the rate. And that's a really good question, but I'm sorry. It's not, yeah. Any others? Well, 5 points to Gryffindor for asking the stumper. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. What an awesome presentation. Get your raffle tickets out.